Hey there, language fans! Back for another deep dive with us. This time we're tackling something that might seem pretty basic at first. The idea of a native speaker.
Yeah, it's a term we hear all the time,
All
right?
right. But have you ever stopped to think about what it actually means? Like, really means?
Honestly, I probably haven't given it as much thought as I should have.
Well, you're not alone. That's exactly what this academic paper we're diving into wants us to do, to think critically about the concept of nativeness.
What's the paper called?
It's titled Rejecting Nativeness to Produce a More Accurate and Just Linguistics, and it was published in the journal Language.
Okay, that's a pretty bold title. Rejecting nativeness makes you wonder what they're proposing instead.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that, but first, let's unpack why the authors think nativeness is such a problematic concept in the first place.
Makes sense. So where do we start?
Well, one of their main arguments is that nativeness is not this neutral, objective category like we often assume it is. They call it a language-ideological assemblage.
A language-ideological assemblage. Okay, that sounds pretty academic. What exactly does that mean?
It means that the idea of a native speaker isn't just a simple description. It's actually a bundle of beliefs and ideologies about language and identity, all tangled up together.
So it's more about our perceptions and assumptions than some kind of scientific fact.
Exactly. And those perceptions and assumptions are shaped by our cultural background and the societies we live in.
So like what we consider a native speaker might be different in different parts of the world.
Exactly. It's not a universal concept at all, even though it's often treated as if it is.
That's interesting. So if nativeness is so subjective and loaded with all these beliefs, what kind of problems does that create?
Well, the authors argue that this focus on native speakers can actually marginalize many people's language experiences. It creates this hierarchy, this idea that there are real speakers and then everyone else.
Oh, I see what you mean. So like someone who is bilingual or multilingual might not fit neatly into that native speaker box.
Exactly. Or someone who learned to sign language later in life. Or anyone whose language journey doesn't fit that traditional narrative of growing up speaking one language from birth.
Right. That makes me think of those stories you hear about deaf children, of hearing parents who learn sign language later. They're still fluent, right?
They absolutely can be. There's research that's shown that deaf children with hearing parents who learn sign language can have similar vocabulary levels to deaf children with deaf parents.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. It really challenges that assumption that you have to learn a language from a young age to be truly proficient.
And it makes you wonder how many other assumptions about native speakers might be just as shaky.
Right, like we're building this whole system of beliefs on something that might not even be true.
It's like building a house on sand.
Mm.
So if clinging to this idea of nativeness can create these hierarchies among speakers, what impact does it have on how we view and categorize languages themselves?
This is a good question. I guess it could lead to us ranking languages, like some are better or more real than others.
The authors make that exact point. They highlight how nativeness is often used to determine if a language is considered alive, dying, or even a real language in the first place.
So, like, if a language doesn't have enough native speakers,
Mm-hmm.
it's somehow less legitimate.
That's the kind of thinking they're critiquing. They point to the practice of counting native speakers to assess the vitality of indigenous languages.
I see the problem there. Simply counting heads doesn't capture the richness of those languages or the efforts communities are making to keep them alive.
You got it. Focusing solely on native speakers misses all the other ways people are connected to a language and contribute to its vitality.
And it overlooks the incredible resilience of languages, their ability to adapt and change.
Exactly. We need to move beyond these oversimplifications and embrace the full spectrum of language experiences and practices.
The authors call it a more inclusive linguistics. So what does a more inclusive linguistics look like in practice? What would that mean for how we study language, how we teach it, and even how we interact with different languages and speakers?
Well, that's a big question, and one we'll explore more deeply in the next parts of this deep dive.
Sounds good. I'm ready to keep learning.
Me too. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more to unpack.
So we're diving into the history of this native speaker idea, right?
Yep. Because if we really want to understand why this concept is so problematic, we need to know where it came from, like how it became so ingrained in our thinking about language.
I'm ready for a history lesson.
Well, get this. One of the sources the authors cite traces the concept of the native speaker all the way back to the Middle Ages.
The Middle Ages. Wow, I didn't realize it went back that far.
Me neither. It's pretty wild. Apparently, the term vernacularis, which means native or domestic, was used to refer to these emerging local languages in Europe.
Ah, so this was back when Latin was still considered the language of scholarship and religion.
Exactly. And as these local vernacular languages started gaining prominence, the idea of a native language became more and more associated with identity and belonging.
Makes sense. People started taking pride in their local languages.
Right. Like, think about Dante Alighieri, the Italian poet. He was a huge advocate for using vernacular Italian instead of Latin.
Oh yeah, he was all about promoting Italian as the language of the people.
Exactly. And this idea of the vernacular, this native language, gets even more interesting when you trace it back to some pretty unexpected beliefs.
Okay, now I'm really curious. Unexpected beliefs. Like what?
Well, according to this historian, Scipione Bonfiglio, there's a connection between the concept of the vernacular and medieval Christian beliefs about breastfeeding.
Wait, breastfeeding, what does that have to do with language?
I know, it sounds strange, right?
Yeah.
But in medieval Christian thought, breastfeeding was seen as this sacred act, transmitting not just nourishment, but also language and culture from mother to child.
Oh, I see. So the mother's language literally became associated with this almost spiritual connection.
Precisely. And this imagery of language being passed down through breast milk reinforced this idea of an innate, almost biological connection to one's native language.
It's amazing how these metaphors and cultural narratives can shape our understanding of language, even for centuries.
It's like those ideas stick with us, even as we learn more about how language actually works.
So it's not just about linguistics, it's about culture and history, too.
Exactly. It shows how deeply embedded the idea of nativeness is in Western thought, carrying centuries of assumptions and ideologies.
It makes you wonder if we can ever truly move beyond it, if it's so ingrained in our culture.
That's a great question. And while it might seem daunting, I think understanding this historical context is crucial. It allows us to critically examine those ingrained assumptions and recognize how they might be limiting our understanding of language.
Yeah, like we can't just pretend those ideas never existed. We had to acknowledge them and then figure out how to move forward.
Exactly. It's not about erasing history, but about building on it and creating a more accurate and inclusive framework for understanding language.
So if we're moving beyond nativeness, what happens to all those areas of linguistics where that concept has been so central? Like, how does this critique play out in fields like sociolinguistics or psycholinguistics?
That's what I'm curious about too. Let's dig into that.
Okay, so sociolinguistics first, right? That's all about how language varies and changes in different social contexts.
Right. It reminds us that language isn't the static thing. It's constantly evolving, influenced by all these social factors.
Exactly. And one of the things that sociolinguistics has really challenged is this idea of the ideal speaker listener that used to be so important in linguistic theory.
Oh yeah, that concept that imagined everyone speaking the same perfect version of a language. Talk about unrealistic.
Total fantasy land. Sociolinguists have shown us that variation is the norm, not the exception, and that variation is meaningful. It reflects the social dynamics of a community.
So instead of searching for this mythical perfect speaker, sociolinguists are more interested in understanding the full spectrum of language use within a community.
Exactly. They're looking at things like regional dialects, social class, gender, ethnicity, and how all of those factors influence the way people speak.
It's like appreciating a tapestry for all its different colors and textures instead of just focusing on one single thread.
Beautiful analogy. And the shift in perspective has been huge for understanding how language actually works in the real world.
Now, what about psycholinguistics? I'm always fascinated by how our brains process and acquire language.
Me too.
Yeah.
And in psycholinguistics, the critique of nativeness has had a big impact on how we think about language learning. For a long time, there was this dominant idea of a critical period for language acquisition.
Oh, yeah, that idea that if you don't learn a language by a certain age, you'll never be as good as someone who did. It's pretty discouraging, actually.
Totally. And it often reinforced the belief that native speakers were just naturally better at languages.
Which, of course, isn't necessarily true.
Right. Research is showing that while early exposure to language can be beneficial, adults can still become very proficient in new languages.
It's like learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And psycholinguistics is helping us understand the different cognitive processes involved in language learning at different stages of life. It's showing us that language learning is a lifelong journey, not just something that happens in childhood.
So instead of focusing on this native versus non-native divide, we should be looking at the individual pathways people take in their language learning journeys.
And valuing the diversity of experiences and approaches.
Okay, so we've talked about sociolinguistics and psycholinguistics. What about a field like language documentation? How does this critique of nativeness play out when we're talking about preserving endangered languages?
That's a great question. And it's one that language documenters are grappling with more and more. Traditionally, the focus was on collecting data from native speakers because they were seen as holding the most authentic knowledge of the language.
Yeah, that makes sense at first glance. You want to capture the language in its purest form, right?
Mhm. Right. But this narrow focus on native speakers ignores the fact that language is always evolving and adapting, even within a community.
So it might actually exclude people who are important members of the language community, but who might have learned the language later in life or who might speak it in a slightly different way.
Exactly. Think about situations of language contact or language shift, where people are learning and using the language in new and creative ways.
And in those situations, focusing solely on native speakers could actually give us a skewed understanding of how the language is used.
It's like looking at a single snapshot instead of watching a whole movie. You're missing the dynamic flow of language, the way it adapts to new contexts and speakers.
So language documentation is becoming more inclusive, recognizing that there are multiple ways to be a speaker of a language and that those different experiences enrich our understanding of the language itself.
Exactly. It's about capturing the full spectrum of voices and practices within a language community, not just those that fit a narrow definition of nativeness.
And that's a good thing, right? It means we're getting a more complete and accurate picture of language diversity.
Absolutely. And it's helping us move away from this idea that languages are static entities
Yeah.
that need to be preserved in some kind of pure form.
Instead, we're recognizing that languages are living things, constantly evolving and adapting to the needs of their speakers.
Which is beautiful and fascinating, don't you think?
Absolutely. Okay, so we talked about how this critique of nativeness is impacting various fields of linguistics. But before we move on, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about how this idea of the native speaker can be really discouraging for language learners.
Yeah, it's something I've definitely struggled with too. It's hard not to feel like you're always falling short when you're comparing yourself to this mythical ideal.
Totally. Like, there's this pressure to sound native-like, even though that's such a subjective and often unattainable goal.
And it takes the fun out of language learning.
It does. Like, we should be celebrating the process of learning a new language, not feeling ashamed of our accents or mistakes.
Exactly. Because let's be honest, who actually speaks a language perfectly anyway? Even native speakers make mistakes, use slang, have regional accents, and all that.
It's all part of what makes language so interesting and dynamic.
So maybe instead of trying to erase those differences, we should be embracing them
I like that. Embracing the messiness and the beauty of language.
and recognizing that we all have something unique to contribute, regardless of whether we're considered native speakers or not.
This is making me rethink my whole approach to language learning. Maybe it's not about trying to fit into some predefined box, but about carving out my own path.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about finding your own voice and your own way of expressing yourself in the language you're learning.
It's about recognizing that the journey itself is valuable, not just the destination.
Well said. I think we're getting to the heart of what this whole deep dive is about. Questioning those old assumptions and creating space for a more inclusive and equitable approach to language.
Where everyone feels empowered to use language in a way that feels authentic to them.
Exactly. And that's a vision worth striving for.
It is. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the history of the native speaker concept to its impact on different fields of linguistics. And we've talked about how this critique can be both liberating and challenging for language learners.
Well, it's been a great discussion so far.
But what about concrete alternatives? If we're going to move beyond this idea of the native speaker, what do we use instead?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And luckily, the authors have some thoughts on that. Let's explore those when we continue our deep dive. So you're eager to hear what we should use instead of native speaker.
Totally. It's all well and good to critique the concept, but we need some practical alternatives if we're going to move forward.
Well, the authors acknowledge it's not a simple fix. They suggest that just swapping in a different term, like, say, L1 speaker or first language speaker, doesn't really solve the problem.
Yeah, those terms still feel pretty loaded. Like, they still imply that the age you learned a language is the most important thing.
Exactly. It's like we're just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, not really addressing the underlying issues.
So what do they suggest we do instead? Like, how do we describe someone's connection to a language without falling back on those old categories?
Well, they propose a more nuanced approach, one that moves away from these essentialized labels altogether.
So instead of trying to categorize people, we should focus on describing their actual language experiences.
Right. It's about acknowledging the complexity of people's language backgrounds.
So instead of just saying native speaker or non-native speaker, we would take into account things like when they started learning the language, how they use it, how proficient they feel.
Exactly. And also considering the different contexts they use the language in. Like, is it for work, for family, for creative expression?
It's like we're painting a more detailed portrait of someone's relationship with the language instead of just using broad brushstrokes.
I love that analogy. It really captures the idea of recognizing individuality and the unique paths people take in their language journeys.
And this shift in perspective can have a ripple effect. Like, it's not just about how we describe language, but also how we teach it and assess language proficiency.
Right. Instead of holding everyone to the same standard of native-like fluency, we can create learning environments that are more inclusive and supportive of different learning styles and goals.
And we can recognize that there are multiple ways to be a successful language user, not just one right way.
Exactly. Because language is about so much more than just grammar rules and pronunciation. It's about communication, connection, and expressing yourself authentically.
You know, this whole conversation has been so thought-provoking for me. It's made me realize how much I've internalized those old assumptions about native speakers and how limiting that perspective can be.
I get it. I've been there too. It's easy to get caught up in those comparisons and feel like we're not good enough. But I think the more we learn about language, the more we realize how much those categories hold us back.
And they make us miss out on the beauty of language diversity, the richness of different accents, dialects, and ways of speaking.
Exactly. It's like looking at a forest and only seeing the tallest trees. You're missing the whole intricate ecosystem beneath the surface.
So instead of focusing on this narrow idea of nativeness, we need to broaden our perspective and appreciate the whole forest, so to speak.
Beautifully put. And that wider perspective, that appreciation for diversity, can extend beyond just language. It can influence how we think about culture, identity, and our interactions with people from different backgrounds.
It's like this deep dive into linguistics has opened up a whole new way of seeing the world, one that's more inclusive and appreciative of difference.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's about recognizing that our differences are what make us interesting and that those differences enrich our understanding of the world.
Well said. And I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the history of the native speaker concept to its impact on different areas of linguistics, and even our own personal experiences as language learners.
It's been a fascinating journey, and hopefully it's given our listeners a lot to think about.
Absolutely. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to check out the original paper, Rejecting Nativeness to Produce a More Accurate and Just Linguistics.
And let's continue the conversation. We'd love to hear your thoughts on social media or wherever you hang out online.
What are some ways we can move beyond the native speaker concept? How can we create a more inclusive and equitable linguistic landscape?
Let's keep challenging those old assumptions and building a world where everyone feels empowered to use language in a way that feels authentic to them.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.